Hi there.
Hilchos.
Hi, Yaakov.
Hi. Hey. Hey, Chaim. Hey.
Where are we at?
159.
Ooh.
That's what I have.
Good evening, everybody.
Evening.
We have finished the sugi of Lash, and now we're going to start page 159, halachas of preparing food on Shabbos, which will be salting food, preparing salt water, coloring food, the malach of tzoveya, which is coloring, spreading food, the malach of mamachek, measuring and weighing food, making signs and shapes in food. That's the preface. Page 159, right? The malach of ma'abed. In the language of Chazal, ma'abed was tanning leather, right? There was a profession. And ma'abed was the malacha that was involved in tanning leather. So in the previous volume and in the shiurim in this volume until here, we have studied about the malachos that most commonly arise when preparing food on Shabbos. Of course, we've talked about bitul, we've talked about grinding, tochein, lash, right? In this year, there will be additional malachos and rabbinic prohibitions that occasionally arise when preparing food, beginning with the malach of ma'abed, tanning. Walter, we're on page 159. The Mishnah Masechta Shabbos lists salting and tanning animals as two of the 39 primary malachos that are prohibited on Shabbos. The Gemara concludes that in truth both are not counted, as salted is merely part of the tanning process and it's not a separate malacha. Tanning, I'm reading the footnote, tanning is the process of preserving raw animal hide so that it may be transformed into leather. Raw hide will decompose rapidly if they are not properly preserved. Tanning involves covering them with salt or soaking in a brine solution to prevent them from decaying during the process, and then soaking them for an extended period in a tanning solution. So the Gemara in Masechta Shabbos Ayin Ham and Beis, when it begins to analyze the Mishnah about the 39 malachos, it says va'molcho va'ma'avdo, one who salts the hide and one who tans it. So the Gemara immediately says, Hainu moilech, hainu ma'avid. I mean, there's no difference between the two. One is the same. So Rav Yochanan, Rish Lakish, Tamar Tavayu, Afik Chai B'nai, V'ayel Shir to it. That means you can remove one of those, either salting or tanning, and replace it with drawing line. Drafting is drawing lines on the hide to indicate where it should be cut. That malacha of drafting replaces salting in the list of 39 malachas. So you have tanning and then drafting instead of the salting, because really tanning and salting are one and the same. The Gemara quotes a dispute among Damei Roim regarding whether salting food in order to preserve it is also included in this malacha. When you make corn,
salad.
well, when you make corned beef, if you take the brisket and you brine it for 3 weeks or 4 weeks, you salt it and you put it away. Could you do that on Shabbos? Would that be considered a malacha? Amar Ravuna Haiman de Malach Bisra, right? Somebody who salts meat. Chayv Mushum Ma'avid. By the way, part of the koshering process is also salting, malicha, right? To draw the blood out of the meat, you need to salt. And there's parameters how long you have to salt for, and then you have to let it drain off. So is that something that could be done on Shabbos? So the Gemara says, no, you're chayiv mishum tanning. Rava ein ibud ba'oichlin. He says the malach of tanning doesn't apply to food. Amar Vashi, I feel Rabbi Ravuna lo amar ela dekaboy leila urcha. Ravuna, when he said it's considered ibud, or when Rabbi Bar Huna said it was ibud, only when he's, for example, going on a trip and he needs to salt the meat to preserve it. Like the sailors in the British Empire, their navy, that's salt beef, that preserved meat for months so they could eat it. That's how sausages came, salami, all of those things was a method of preserving meat that it would last for long periods of time without refrigeration. They didn't have refrigeration on those sailing vessels that went away for 2-3 months. Ava lebese, but if you're salting meat for your home, so lo mashvi inish michla eitz. So you're not going to make your food inedible. That we're talking about salting something so that it really becomes like an industrial piece of wood. So if it's for your own consumption, you wouldn't salt the meat to that degree that it would approximate tanning. So according to all views, salting food in preparation for consumption is permitted on Shabbos, at least on a biblical level. The dispute only pertains to salting meat in order to preserve it for later. The Rambam rules in accordance with Rava that the malach of tanning never applies to food. Hamafshit mina or kedei lasos kamei chayiv. If you skin an animal's hide on Shabbos, and you skinned enough to make a kameya, an amulet, you're chayiv. V'cheina ma'aved mina or kedei lasos kamei chayiv. That gives us a shear. If you tan a portion of an animal's hide large enough to make an amulet, you're chayiv on Shabbos for ma'aved. The echad ma'aved ve'echad moidleach, whether you tan or salt, shamalicha min iburu, salting is like tanning, but ein ibud ba'ochlin, says the Rambam, this is in Hilchos Shabbos Yudal. Rabbeinu Yeshaya of Trani rules, in accordance with Rabbi Rav Huna and Ravashi, that salting meat for preservation is a biblical prohibition of the malach of tanning. Given the Ravashi, this is the Piskei Arid, which is an important halachic source for us. Given the Ravashi Mefarsh L'Milsei, he explained Rabbi Rav Huna, so Shmamina Dahachil, so that's the halacha, v'yesh ibud b'yochlin. So tanning or salting extensively does apply at food. If the purpose of the salting the meat is to preserve the meat for long periods. Trani was a town in Italy, and he studied in the yeshiva in Speyer, right? Shum was Speyer, Vermeisa, and Magenz. Those were the three cities in northern Germany. Rashi learned in Worms, in that yeshiva, before he went back to France. Those three communities were destroyed during the Crusades, 1190, and many Jews killed there. But that was in Shum. He studied in Speyer, but went back to Italy. The Or Zeru in Vienna was also there. I was working on my Sefer Kahal Hashem, which is the halachic Sefer on Ptsuadaka, urology and Jewish law. There's a famous tshuva by the Tosas Arid, by the Piskei Arid that we quote. So he's someone that is very commonly used in halacha. Tosas writes, back to 161, Tosas writes, even according to Rava, salting food is rabbinically prohibited on Shabbos in some circumstances. You cannot say that salting food is permitted. The Gemara in the 12th chapter states that salting is rabbinically prohibited. Now let's go into this rabbinic prohibition a little bit more. The Gemara that Tosfos invokes to demonstrate that salting involves an Isser D'Rabbanan appears later in Masechta Shabbos. The Gemara concludes that salting radishes is prohibited on Shabbos, although merely dipping radishes in salt is permitted. You don't salt radishes and eggs on Shabbos. Rav Chizkiah Mishmei Rabbi Amar Tznon Aser, radishes are prohibited, he agrees, but beitza muteres. Amar Rav Nachman Mereshav Malchana Pugla, he would salt radishes. Amina Avsudikam Avsidnan Le, because I'm ruining it by doing so. Damar Shmuel Pugla Churfa Ma'ali, that good sharp radishes, spicy radishes is good, and salt reduces that. And salt will reduce the sharpness, so you basically are being mekalkel, you're ruining the radish, you're being mafsided. But kivan the shamalaha. But then I heard the Asa Ulav Amar b'Ma'arva Malchi Kishri, that when Ula came from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia, he said that in Eretz Yisrael they do salt piles of radishes, which implies that it's a good thing for radishes. So Mamalach lo malchanan, so I stopped salting radishes. To buli vadi matvilam. He dips them though, right? They would have a little salt on the table and they would dip the radish in the salt. That you can do. But to salt it sort of industrially, to preserve them, that you can't do. So the implication is that the salting is prohibited if it improves food significantly. Rashi explains that the improvement is the hardening of the food. In mochin stonu beitza shalosh ve'arba chatichas yachol, 3 or 4 pieces together. Shamelech ma'abdim v'nasin kashin. There's a process where they become hard, vavi tikun, and therefore it's a correction for them. The Hebrew word that Rashi uses is ma'abed, the same root for tanning hides. It's possible that the use of this root alludes to the prohibition being related to the malach of tanning, which the Mishnah Berurah later on will understand. The main emphasis seems to be on the improvement of the food through it becoming hard, which may suggest that this improvement is the inherent problem rather than the similarity to tanning. So, as we have seen according to Tosfos, this prohibition is related to malach of tanning. The Rambam writes that salting radish is prohibited due to the similarity to pickling, which is like cooking, right? If you pickle something, if you put something in brine, let it sit there. So in Yoredeya, we already learned that can transfer meat to milk. You can absorb prohibited flavors through not just heat, but even through the pickling process. It's got to be for a period of time. But the Rambam seems to say that salting is going to be prohibited because it's like cooking it. Mutter limloch beitza, you can salt an egg, aval tznon, on radish v'kayotze be'oser. V'nei shenir k'koivish, you're pickling. K'vashim b'Shabbos v'koivish oser v'nei shehu kim vashel. It's too similar to cooking. But mutter l'tabel tznon v'kayotze be'melech v'ochel, you can dip your radish and other foods into salt and eat it. The Shulchan Aruch uses the Rambam's explanation. He says, you may not salt 4 or 5 pieces of radishes together. It's like you're pickling. It looks like pickling is prohibited. It's too much like cooking. But what you can do is you can dip individual things into salt. You can salt eggs. The Mishnah Berurah notes that this is the Rambam's understanding, and he adds that according to Rashi, this prohibition is related to the malach of tanning, not cooking, right? But Varashi knows sometimes they are melach, miskash to become hard. Vavi tikun, it's like correcting. Vidami lemevid, it's like tanning. So if careful reading of the Rishonim quoted above, meaning Rashi, Rambam, indicates that there's also a practical dispute between Rashi and the Rambam. Rashi states explicitly that the prohibition of salting radishes applies when salting several pieces together, whereas the Rambam uses singular language and applies that salting even one piece is prohibited unless one merely dips it in salt and eats it immediately. The Shulchan Aruch appears to be self-contradictory in this regard, stating that the prohibition applies to salting 4 or 5 pieces together, but only explicitly permitting dipping one piece in salt and eating it immediately. The Taz discusses this question. He concludes that leaving even one piece in salt for an extended period is prohibited, and dipping several pieces in salt together is prohibited, even if they are not left to sit in the salt. Says the Taz, there are 2 conditions. It's similar to tanning. If it dwells too long in the salt, that the bitter taste emerges after it produces moisture in a natural way. Even dipping one by one and leaving it for a period of time would be problematic. Shenis, by doing it all together, large quantities, even if you don't let it sit for a while, it's usher. It's too similar to tanning. But dipping each piece individually is permitted. The Mishnah Berurah quotes the same as the Taz. Rav Nissim Karelitz in the Chut HaShani writes that even if pickling vegetables, similar to cooking them, pickled vegetables may be returned to the liquid they were pickled in. Although returning cooked food to the fire is prohibited under certain circumstances, and some Rishonim explain that this is due to the similarity to cooking, Chazal did not impose a similar prohibition due to the appearance of pickling. You have pickles in a pickle jar that are in brine. They're fully pickled. If you take them out, you can put that into the pickle jar. There is no pickling after pickling. It's no marisayin. Sometimes returning cooked food to the fire, if it's a covered fire, we said it's a problem because it looks too much like cooking. That whole issue of marisayin by kvisha does not exist. So now that we have discussed the parameters of which type of salting is prohibited, we must determine which types of items are included. The Rambam in Source 8 writes that the prohibition applies to radishes and the like. The Taz explains that this includes anything that requires salting. The Taz says, Lav dafket snon, not only radish, kagon, betzalim, onions, vishumim, garlic. That's why the Rambam says radishes and the like. Yes.
They're not talking about the red radishes. They were talking about what they call black radish. It's large. They're probably slices.
Okay, but why?
The slice would sweat, where the whole radishes, the red ones, wouldn't sweat even if you salt it by itself.
Saul is making a point that he thinks it's dealing with the black radish, not the red radish. Because the red radish
does not
It has an outside.
has an outside. You're talking about the black radish is sliced and then you're going to slice the salty inner pieces, and that'll sweat, but the red radishes will not. Well, let's see if that's borne out. Let's see. The Mishnah Berurah cites the Pri Megadim, limits the prohibition to foods that are normally pickled. This is presumably because the foods that are normally pickled are those foods for which salting is effective at preserving, which applies the prohibition to legumes as well.
But cucumbers,
Cucumbers can be pickled, so
then you can. Yeah, we'll
you
see.
can't,
Well, who's doing
you
it
wouldn't be
anyway?
able to salt
Not in Shabbos.
cucumbers on Shabbos. It can be done before. But you could dip one cucumber at a time into salt and eat
You
it.
can, right.
You can't eat those because it will start to
So you
sweat.
can't make cucumbers.
What about preparing salt water?
Yes,
Another question involving salt is whether you can prepare salt water on Shabbos. This comes into play, of course, by the Seder. Yeah, because sometimes the Seder's Friday night, and you have to prepare the salt water before. Can you do it on Shabbos? So this question is disputed by the Tanoim. It says, Ein oisin hilmi b'Shabbos. Hilmi is brine, right? Salted water. Aval oisu is mea melach. So you can't make brine, but you can make salt water. The toivel ben pito. And you can dip your bread in it. And v'noisel tochatavsha. You can pour it into cooked food. Rav Yosef Alo Hilmi. Well, I don't understand. Isn't salt water, isn't that brine? What's the difference? Bein meruba, bein mu'at, whether it's large quantity or small quantity. So the Mishnah says, Eluhein mei melech hamutar. This is what is an example of the salt water that we permit. Noisin shemen lechatchila l'toch hamayim, or l'toch hamelech. Salt water in which one places oil initially into the water or into the salt, which is salt water prepared not in the usual manner. So the Gemara says, my Komar. The Gemara didn't understand what the Tana meant in trying to distinguish between brine and salt water. You can't make large quantities of salt water, but you can make small quantities. The Gemara continues by questioning the meaning of Rabbi Yossi, that there's no difference between preparing a large or small quantity of salt water. The Amoraim debate this question. The Gemara concludes that according to Rabbi Yossi, preparing even a small quantity of salt water is prohibited on Shabbos unless oil is added. The Gemara then quotes a Baraisa, which states that preparing concentrated salt water containing 2/3 salt or more is prohibited according to all opinions. Tani Rabbi Bar Chabiba, in oisin mei melach azin, very strong brine. My melech azin, Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Davar Kol Shabetz at Safaben. If an egg will float in it, the kama Amrabaya trade tilsi milcha v'tilsa maya. 2/3 by volume salt, 1/3 volume water. L'maya avdilei. What was this used for? Amravavo l'mursayu, for fish brine, which was called mursa. Why did this is of course a rabbinic prohibition. What's the reason for making salt water, for why there's a prohibition of making salt water on Shabbos? And what are the conditions where it might be permitted? Rashi indicates, while discussing the view of Rabbi Yossi, that it is similar to the malach of ma'abed, tanning, since both improve the substance being salted. The hide is improved when salted, and certain foods are also improved when salted. Rashi, in his comment on V'halo hu hilmi bein rav bein ma'ad, well, brine or salt water, what's the difference? More mafarish, l'chumra, Rabbi Yossi. Really, Rabbi Yossi was l'chumra. He wanted to say that even a minor amount would be usher, the kulam le'isser. Bibnei shuhu k'ma'abi, it's like tanning. And therefore you're a metakin esa'ochel, you're fixing the food. Hanoisin l'soicha kadesh yiskayim, in order even for preservation is an improvement on the food. That's Rashi, but the Rambam explains that preparing a large quantity has the appearance of performing a malacha related to cooking, which was similar to the previous approach we saw in source 8. The Ritva said that preparing concentrated salt water is a weekday activity, uvda dechol, like, why don't we play basketball on Shabbos? You're in a fenced, you're not carrying the ball. Our Rebbein used to teach us, it's uvda d'chol. It's something that you do, it's a weekday activity. People don't jog on Shabbos. I mean, what's the issue of jogging on Shabbos? Uvda d'chol. You'll ask me, somebody just asked me last Shabbos, well, we walk on Shabbos. Some people take long walks for exercise, an hour. Why is that different than jogging? It's different. It's because uvda d'chol is it's hard to pin down. The Gemara never really defines it. Here you see multiple Rishonim use uvda d'chol when they want to use it. It's so. The Ritva said that the Rambam's explanation was that uvda d'chol. Preparing even a small quantity of strong salt water is prohibited, as it appears as if one is preparing fish brine. The Mrabanan Hilchos Shabbos says, "Ma'ariv adam mayim u'melach v'shemen." A person can mix water, salt, oil, the toivel bod pito, and therefore you can dip your bread in it. Or nosel tafshel, or this mixture could be put into a cooked dish, as long as hu shiyasa ma'at. You're making a small amount of al harbe osir. And look at the words when they shenire ka'oisa malacha mimlechas atafshel. Again, it's like a Mara sign. It looks like you're cooking. You shouldn't make strong brine, which is vein shnei shlishin melach or shlish mayim. Basically, quoting the Gemara in Masechta Shabbos. They should near a ka'oisa moris. The Rambam is clearly ruling against the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, and the other Rishonim also rule this way, like the Rambam. The Kesef Mishnah, I'm reading footnote 7, explains further that brine is usually used to pickle fish. So preparing brine gives the appearance that one wishes to pickle fish on Shabbos, which has the appearance of cooking. Therefore, one may prepare a small quantity of salt water, provided that it's not too strong. The Shulchan Aruch rules accordingly, but he adopts the reason given by Rashi. Ein oisin mei melech harbe biyachad, lo seis l'tochat kvashim, to put into pickled vegetables. Mishum dedami leibud, it's like tanning. He doesn't say like Rambam, like it's cooking. Aval yachol, which is a little unusual for Rav Yosef Karo, right? We know Rav Yosef Karo usually is following the Rambam. He's a Sfardi, but here he's following the Rashi. You can make small quantities. If it's too strong, 2/3 salt, you can't even make a small amount. These are all later achronim, who define a small amount as the amount needed for dipping at one meal. They disagree, however, whether the salt water may be prepared even for a meal later in the day or only just before the meal. We learned above in the Mishnah that Rabbi Yossi prohibits preparing even a small quantity of salt water on Shabbos. But he permits this if one adds oil to the water or to the salt, as the oil reduces the potency of the salt. The halacha, though, follows the chachamim, and only preparing a large quantity of salt water is prohibited. But what if one wishes to prepare a large quantity of salt water containing oil? Do we still accept the leniency given by Rabbi Yossi's halacha? The Rambam quoted above refers to preparing a mixture of water, salt, and oil, and prohibits making a large amount. So it seems like he doesn't adopt the leniency of Rabbi Yossi, but the Mishnah Berurah quotes a dispute as to whether this prohibition applies even when the oil is added before the salt. Some rule leniently in that case. So if you add oil to the salt first, there you could make even a large quantity. The Olat Shabbos reasons that Rabbi Yossi's leniency is certainly agreed to by the Chachamim, who rule more leniently than him. He therefore expresses surprise that the Shulchan Aruch did not mention this leniency. The Eliyah Rabbah, who was a later Achron, writes that the Shulchan Aruch was right not to mention it, and the Chachamim did not accept it. He proves this from the Rambam and other Rishonim, who, like the Shulchan Aruch, do not stipulate that the prohibition of preparing a large quantity is dependent on the order in which the ingredients are mixed. Rather, there was a flat prohibition, regardless of the order when the oil was put in. But the Mishnah Berurah says, Im noisin shemen la'mayim, if you put oil in the water, kodim shenoisin ha'melach l'soichai, before you add the salt, Oba melach kodim shenoisin ha'mayim, or you add the oil to the melach before you put the water in it, yesh mekilin, some allow you to make large quantities. Mishum she'ashemen machlish es koach ha'melach. The oil weakens the strength of the salt. Milios as, so it's not so briny. And ain't a love shame me melech. It loses its name of brine. Vuda asru, bada asru munosin shemen lebesot mishum debeshash noisin mayim melech. Those that prohibit when you put the oil in later is because the moment you put water and salt together, it's tanning. So one practical application of the prohibition on preparing salt water is like we talked about when Seder night falls on Shabbos, as our practice is to do the carpus in salt water. The Mishnah Berurah writes that one should prepare the salt water before Shabbos. If one did not do so, he should prepare only a small quantity. I mean, you always prepare a small quantity. We don't have a big quantity of salt water. You make that little dish and everyone dips the potato. How much salt water do you need to dip that
Also,
little
we don't do
piece of
two-thirds-
potato
We
in?
also don't do 2/3 salt. You take some more water and you put a little like this, sprinkle a little salt, so it's never the 2/3.
Well, but
Right? It's
Yeah, but we
never-
still say you're not supposed to prepare a large quantity of salt even when it's not as. The small quantity you can't do if you're making the 2/3 salt. Then you can't even do a small. But the small quantity is not a problem.
But we make little bowls.
So in Chal b'Shabbos, Yasa me'melech kodim Shabbos, lo Yasa b'Shabbos k'mo shekosu b'simin. You shouldn't do it the same way. V'im lo asa kodim Shabbos, ve'en lo choymet litvol ben, yesh lasos me'melech, you should make a small amount. You have to make sure, like the footnote says, that has to be less than 2/3 salt. The Mishnah Berurah seems to hold, I'm reading footnote 11, that one may prepare salt water on Yom Tov that does not fall on Shabbos, presumably due to the rules of Oichel Nefesh, which permit performing men melachos on Yom Tov while preparing food. Some, such as the Chai Adam, rule stringently that one should ideally prepare the salt water before Yom Tov. This is even when Yom Tov is Tuesday night, because of this issue of tanning. If tanning is prohibited, then it doesn't make a difference if it's Oichel Nefesh. However, most rule in accordance with the Mishnah Berurah. He mentions the Piskei Teshuvos, and he brings Rav Simcha Bunim Korn laws of Yom Tov, the Ramah, who cites two opinions concerning whether salting vegetables is permitted normally on Yom Tov.
Ernie,
Yes.
Ernie, I understand how it can be compared to tanning. It's just water. It's a solution. It's water. When it comes to tanning, you're taking other parts and changing them. You're not. You've got water and salt.
By the way, Walter,
Tanning, there's a process.
right? So producing
Okay, sorry. I don't know why I'm picking up.
producing very salty brine, the Gemara says that's to make brine. So you're not allowed to do it because you're not allowed. That's
Yeah,
considered
but
either according to Rashi,
but the salt.
tanning, or it's considered like the Rambam. It's like cooking. So that's so regular small amount of, if it's not 2/3, that we said is okay.
Small.
But if it's
Right.
2/3 salt,
Okay.
then it's brine, and then it's either we saw it. It's either Rashi who says it's too much like tanning, and the Rambam it says it's mechze kavishu. What about adding vinegar? Salting several pieces of radish together is prohibited on Shabbos. The Taz observed that the common practice in his locale was to salt ground radish and to add vinegar. He attempts to resolve this practice based on the fact that the radish is not left with the salt alone. Rather, vinegar is added immediately, thus reducing the potency of the salt. Sorach Iyun, the Taz was wondering about the local custom bin Agenu, shechotchim b'Shabbos tznon, the Jews would come home from shul on Shabbos, cut up radish, dak, that's very fine, v'noisna so b'ka'ara, put them in a dish, u'molchen oso, salted, v'shoivchen alav chometz, pour vinegar, v'oichlen osoi, and eat it. Hadami is laharbe chatichos to usher. So the Taz says, doesn't this appear like you're doing many pieces together, which we say is prohibited? I feel a moichel miyad, even if you eat it right away. He said if you eat it right away, you can do one by one. You can't salt lots of pieces. So ein heter el derech tibul kol echad b'fnei atzmo. He said the Shulchan Aruch paskin. We said that it's only one by one that you dip and eat. So what's this minig that was in his community where they chopped up the large amount of radishes, salted it? How did they do that? That l'chora is against the Shulchan Aruch. Everybody understand his issue? So he now explains. It wasn't allowed to sweat. They poured vinegar on it. The vinegar sort of reduced the problem. If you pour vinegar and other ingredients, it's not comparable to tanning, or like like brining something. It's more like they made a salad, and that l'chura is okay. I think thus, according to the Taz, salting radishes, adding vinegar is permitted, similar to the ruling of some of the Achronim that we discussed above, that permitted mixing water, salt, and oil. The Tosefet Shabbos observe that this comparison is questionable, as the above leniency with vinegar applies only when adding the oil, or the leniency of the oil was only when the oil was added before the salt is mixed with the water. Whereas the common practice was to salt the radish and then add the vinegar. So the Tosefet Shabbos resolves that difficulty. He explains that since it is well known that vinegar will be added to the salted radish, the initial salting bears no similarity to tanning and is therefore permitted. They know that other ingredients are going to go in, so it's not just the object with the salt. It's they're making a salad, and that's okay. He's bringing the halacha that if you add the oil too late, even the matchila avedi surah can appear Rashi. Since you did salt and the item, the radish, it's like Rashi where you tanned it. So the tzarich li'itchop, we have to push that aside, li'ashev and reconcile. The shani osam shenya dua mitchila she'iterach hakam shel socho. They didn't know that they were going to add oil, but here we know you're going to add vinegar. Rav Nissim Karelitz, right, a recent posek, observes that the resolution of the Taz and the Tzurba Shabbos was only offered as a charitable defense of the common practice, should not be relied on ab initio, which is lechatchila. Rather, one should add oil before salting these radishes to fulfill the heter that was given by the Shulchan Aruch, that you could do a large amount if you added oil to the mixture. Says the Chut Hashani, who's Rav Nissim Karelitz. Kosav Mishnah Berurah, Zelashono, Uminagenu, the minig of the Chafetz Chaim, Shechoitchim b'Shabbat Snon Dak, they would chop radishes, V'nois Naisoba Ka'ara, put it in a plate, Umochnoso, salted, V'shokol of Choymetz, V'chnoso, V'churu, Hudami Laharbe Chatichos Tosa Medina. I guess the Mishnah Berurah quoted the Taz and says, why should this be permitted? You're doing many pieces. I feel if you eat it right away. The leniency is only if you do it one by one. Nira, he says, quoting the Taz, Ad kan l'shoina, which we read. If you salt vegetables, where the Mishnah seems to say that's permitted by salting and then adding, either vinegar or oil. He says, Eino elarak b'toras limud chus amineg ha'olam. The Chut Hashani was pointing out that the Taz saw that there was a local custom, and he tried to justify the local custom. Aval ein zeheter board. It's not clear why it should be accepted leniency. Elam kein noisnes Hashem in koydem hamelach. If the oil, or I would say, quote, vinegar, is added first before you salt, the mutter lachatchila, like the Gemara in Poskim. Near the shir Hashem and litain birakos of a melach, the amount of oil to put with vegetables, kadesh lo yeh isur mishum ma'abed, hu shir shu ba'ofen shemelach lo yeh lo kol kach hashpah. It's enough where the salt will not have that much influence. and it won't look like pickling. The Piskei Teshuvos, also a more recent posek, writes that adding other liquids as an alternative to oil also permits adding salt, as long as one does not add too much salt. He says shemen lav davka, it's not just much oil. He says elu adin choyme, it's the same thing, vinegar. Or mei limun, or lemon juice. Ushar mashkim. Umayim, water. Achaynu davkim noisimat melech, as long as you don't salt it too much. Just enough salt to add flavor. Va'az haritivut shalamayim, the moisture of the water, or shar mashkim, or the lemon juice or the vinegar, gorein lach lashat koach hamelech, it leads to weakening the strength of the salt. Shelo yigrom lazosay, the vegetable will not sweat. V'lichshosh ibud, and therefore we don't have to be concerned about ibud, tanning. If you have too much salt, adding these liquids are not going to help. By having liquid there, you're making salt brine, which is its own isser. Zulat isra ibud vakvish, not besides the pickling that you're doing to the vegetable itself. So making salt water, that was Walter's question. It's a problem, and therefore you just shouldn't add too much salt. Okay,
The Isser of making salt water is uvda dechol? Independent Isser.
No. The Ritva mentioned that in explaining the Rambam. The Rambam mainly said it was too much like, the Ritva said that it was preparing concentrated salt water is a weekday activity in uvda dechol. But the Rambam said preparing strong salt water as it appears as one is preparing fish brine, which he said is related to cooking. So that's a machlokas in the Rambam. On what basis are they prohibiting? But it's still prohibited. And
But he
Rashi
says
said
here at the end,
huh?
but that's pickling. I mean, that's the issue of pickling, which is like
No, but that's
cooking.
preparing this. But even preparing the salt, why else are you doing it? You're doing it because the Gemara asked, why are you preparing this azus? To prepare for fish brine. So preparing the salt water is a preparatory step for the pickling, and that itself is its own isser. That's what we're seeing here. And echanami, salting the vegetables is one isser, and creating the strong salt brine is a separate problem.
And it's, I mean, what's the Isser? What Av Malacha is it?
No, we said none of this is an av malacha.
Yeah, but it's
Gemara
a
says
told avoda.
Einoisin me melech azin.
Right,
What
but
is
if you
it?
prepare
All
fish brine,
shabbats at safaban. Trade tilts and they get a my of delay. Why did they use this? Lemuraisa. To make this fish brine. And the Isser Rashi said it has to do with tanning. And the Rambam said it makes too much like cooking. That's when you
Right.
actually salt the radish. But even pouring the salt brine in l'chora is, as we said, the Ritva said it's uvda dechol.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure they had the crystallized salt like where. I mean, it's probably kashering salt. It's probably very strong salt. It's
The
probably,
Ketuv's Mishnah explained further that brine is usually used to pickle fish. So preparing brine gives the appearance that one wishes to pickle fish on Shabbos, which has the appearance of cooking. You see what's going on here? It's maris. It's all rabbinic. There's no av malacha here.
right? But it's the rabbinic prohibition of cooking. It's bishul.
According to Rambam.
Okay,
According to Ritva, uvda dechol. According to Rashi, ibud.
okay.
That's
That's what I said. Ibda dechol. Okay, that's what I thought.
Uvda dechol is uvda dechol is actually, I would say, the most lenient. That's the Ritva. Uvda dechol is when it's like a grab bag.
I know it's a very elastic concept.
Very
Covers
elastic.
a lot of
Nothing else.
stuff.
So
Right.
the Ritva was the most lenient. I think that's why they brought him to show that. Okay. So we did the Piskei Teshuvos. Okay. What about salting salads? This is quite common, for our wives. The Orchos Shabbos summarized the halachas we have learned so far pertaining to salting food, preparing salt water on Shabbos. He adds that salting of vegetable cells permitted if most of the vegetables in the salad are not commonly pickled in salt. So even if you have some cucumbers in there, so cucumbers are pickled, but as he said, if most of the vegetables in the salad are not commonly pickled, so if you have lettuce and all the other vegetables and you have some cucumber, that's not most.
You also have tomatoes. Tomatoes also are pickled.
Are they?
Yeah, you can buy pickled tomatoes. Betamta, I happen to like it. Betamta sells pickled tomatoes, as well as pickled pickles.
Fluently, which means more would not be pickled, which is used.
Correct. So Saul wants to say most our salads, usually the majority is not these vegetables that are pickled. Even the way Yaakov is saying about a tomato. Even some people pickle tomatoes. You pickle tomatoes?
No,
No, but I eat pickled tomatoes.
You do?
Sure.
do you?
I do. They're very good.
They're very good.
Do they taste like
Buy-
pickles? Like, is it like a,
What do you mean?
It's
You-
a little bit different. A little bit different than pickles. It has a pickle taste, but it also
Yeah.
tastes a little like a tomato. It's a little bit of a different taste.
I'd like this taste. Susie, he says Batamta makes it. We should
Yeah,
try it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I
And
haven't,
they last a lot, they last a long time too.
okay.
You have to promise to eat them.
So let's see what the Orchos Shabbos says. Ein loses melach al gabi mina yeroko shederch b'nei lekovshin. So you can't put salt on vegetables that normal people pickle. Or sheteva melach lifol b'amibut, or the strength of the salt will cause tanning. V'lachein also litein melach al gabi chatichos tznon. You can't salt multiple pieces of radish or botzel, onion, shum, garlic, or malafafonim, or cucumbers. One by one, he's going to say you can do it, or one by one you can dip it. Right? Isser zen nemer af ba'ofen shekavanoso lechol l'si yarakos elim yad. This prohibition applies even if you're going to eat these vegetables right away. V'lo lahamtin ad sheyikavchu, and you're not planning to wait until it becomes pickled. Or sheyasa b'mivur, or the tanning process goes through to its completion. So the question is why? Hatami shum sharei ze nira. We're in the category of nira. Harei ze nira kavol likvosh kvoshim la'abed. It's a marasayan. It looks like you're going to pickle. V'im noisin shemen or chometz al gabe chatichos. If you put oil or vinegar on these pieces, now we're talking about if you have multiple pieces, right, of radish or cucumber or whatever else we said, the onion and garlic. Mutter litin alem gamela. So then there's a heter right here. You can salt these vegetables even in a large quantity if you've added a little bit of oil or vinegar to it. It removes it from the maris ayin of looking like kibbush. That's really all that's going on. It has nothing to do with the recipe and the taste and like that. We're going around the maris ayin of tanning, or kivu or kavush, like the Rambam learned. Because pickling is similar to cooking. I brought the Yoredei issues in because kavush is an important sugya in Yoredei about not just, we know that prohibited flavor of something non-kosher transfers with heat, but it also transfers with kavush, with pickling, because it's similar to cooking. So that's an important yisod. So that's number one. We have a heter. Then he says, "Mutar latek melach al gabe chaticha achas shel tzno." You can salt an individual piece of radish, or malafafon, or an individual cucumber, the chadome, im kavanoso la'ochlo toch zman ktsar, if you want to eat it right now. Here comes that word again. Eino nira klal. There's no marasayin of pickling. Aval im kavanato, if when you salt this cucumber, your intention is lahashosas achaticha b'melach zman merupa. You want it to sit there for a long time. Amanasha melech yiflot b'men atzir, so that the melech will draw out the fluid from the cucumber. Hareza osir mishum shov and zareza ma'abin mamish v'osir. So that's mamish did ibud, and that's osir. That already could be more of an av malacha. Yeroko shein derech lekov shon b'melach. vegetables that normally are not pickled. And ve'ena melech poel be'em ibud. And we see that when you salt these things, it doesn't create any kind of tanning phenomenon. Mutter lefazer le'melech. You can salt them to your heart's content. L'chein mutter lefazer melech al gabe prusas akvaniyah. So this is a problem, Yaakov. He says
No.
you can salt tomatoes.
Yeah.
So again, I don't think it's that common, and that's why it's less of an issue. As
You know,
most-
it's funny because he says that onions we pickle. I don't know of anyone who pickles onions. Onions are not pickled today. They keep saying onion, garlic.
onion and
radishes.
garlic, right?
But onion, we pickle tomatoes. We don't pickle onion.
Most things were pickled to preserve them.
Saul says in the earlier days, these kind of items were pickled to preserve them.
I agree, but they're not today. And tomato is today pickled.
You can still buy a jar.
That's my point.
Pickled
People
carrots
now
and-
do pickle onions. We always pickle onions.
Yeah, you see now pickled onions
It's a thing.
is a thing when you go to restaurants. It's the
Yeah.
salatim. It's coming back.
But it's a new thing. I mean, it's new in the
Yes,
sense that
yes.
I never saw it.
That's
My
true, but
mother
it
never
is coming
pickled it.
back.
Celery, carrot, you have
I
a
love
jar
those.
of all those things.
Yeah. That's good.
Okay, so the halacha changes based on local custom, but he does say he brings zagvaniya as an example of a vegetable that usually are not pickled. Chatichos pilpel, people, red pepper, green pepper,
Mhm.
those things are not pickled.
We
Those
used
are
to
pickled
always,
too?
we used to always, yeah.
Peppers are pickled, definitely.
Pickled peppers. Peter Piper
Peter
pick up.
Piper.
There you go.
Piper picked up Papa pickled peppers. Okay, Yud. Near the mutrulite melech besalat yirakot, vegetable salad. Asher asui ruba mirakot shein derech lakosher mocham. If the majority of the salad is made of vegetables that are not pickled, you can salt it. Mutrulite melech al gabi beitza. You can salt an egg. We're talking about a hard-boiled egg, I guess, on Shabbos. What kind of egg are you eating, right? Or basar mavushalim. You want to salt your brisket or a piece of meat that you're eating, or cholent v'chen al gabi shar ma'acholim. Ein lachin mei melech merubim. But don't prepare large quantity of salt water, l'tzorch tibul, in order to dip. Mishum shenire kibal avid yirakos b'mei melech. Again, it's a maris sign that you're doing it to pickle vegetables. Mutter lachin mei melech muatim. You can make small amount. Kashir nitzrach l'sudachas for enough for one suda.
It's like you have to understand all this kind of stuff. You need to know exactly what the process is when if you salt something too much or you salt something too little. Does it change the taste? Does it change the piece itself? In other words, you're changing something on Shabbos.
Right. So for those vegetables that typically are pickled, you cannot salt them. We said unless you add oil or vinegar or water to it in advance, then you can.
And I understand to dilute it, but even salting an egg.
You say it again?
Changing the taste.
Walter?
Even salt. I'm breaking out. Okay.
Yeah, you're breaking. No, the egg. Remember, the Gemara permitted an egg. Remember, there was an exception where the Gemara permitted an egg. That's why they permit an egg. I want to finish 2 more pages, and then yeah. Why? Yeah, I want to finish. Rav Neuwirth in Shmir Shabbos Kolchasa quotes from Shlomo Zalman as rule that one may even salt vegetables that are commonly pickled if they have been chopped or have not been peeled. They are not commonly pickled in this state. So if they're not peeled, so we have a cucumber that's not peeled, or like an Israeli salad that's chopped up, that would be a heter. Any food that normally is not preserved through salting, just the salt improves their taste. Eggs or tomatoes. You can salt them to your heart's desire. As long as you're going to eat it today. So better to salt them right before the Suda. Shamati Magon Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Since the whole, I mentioned about 5 times the word nira. It's all a mar sign of tanning. So Rav Shlomo Zalman was very practical. The whole time of Nira, Kema Aved, Ein Regilim Lichvosh Rak Agvaniyot Shlemot. So for example, like Yaakov said,
He says it in the next sentence.
pickle tomatoes, you hold tomatoes. So if you cut tomatoes up into pieces, you don't pickle it that way. Lachein muter lemochem kashen chatuchos. So when you cut tomatoes like we do in slices, that's not a problem, because tomatoes are pickled whole. Cucumbers. Go look at a pickle jar. It's whole pickles. Yeah, you can find spears, but in general, it's whole. Usually it has the peel on it. The gamrakim shem shlemim when they're whole. What he's saying is a heter. If you chop up the cucumbers, or certainly if you peel them, there's no problem. He says af b'tznon. He says tzorchiyun. He's going to give a heter by radish too. And reglin klalakov. We don't pickle our radishes today. The gam lo nir kavai doesn't look like tanning. Achei lahakel b'tznon. He says don't be lenient. Oil the niskar b'gemor daser. Since the Gemara is particularly mentioned snon, we shouldn't do it. Except with the way we mentioned you can do. Like you can dip one by one. You can even do large amounts as long as you put oil on it. Mashenkin lagabe agvaniyot. Agvaniyot were not mentioned in the Gemara. And Rav Avadia Yosef concurs that salting a vegetable cells is permitted, although he adds that it is a meritorious practice to add oil or other liquids immediately. I think what he's saying is, even if you salt it first, as long as you add the oil and the vinegar right away, it's as if it's accomplishing the same thing, not to make it look like ma'abe. He mentions that tomatoes and lettuce are not usually pickled, and they are salted primarily to improve taste.
I think this all depends on where you are and what the Jews' food is, because
Right, but Yaakov, I want to say something else about most householders are not going to pickle their own tomatoes. Would you agree to that? You're going to buy it in a jar.
But
So that's what's going on here we're talking about, but people might pickle cucumbers at home.
my son does. My grandson does.
What, cucumbers?
It's true. Yeah, he does cucumbers.
Yeah, so that's these things. What they're not usually, but so when we're doing it at home, if it's not usually done, that's why I think they were more lenient about tomatoes. Says the Rav Ovadia, salad gvaniyot, a tomato salad. Mutar latet alav melach. You can add salt for taste. Le'choloto la'alter. You can eat it right away. Boto suda. Ve'im is a chashash b'shum kovesh kvoshim klal. There's no pickling. Kol makom. You notice he doesn't say that you have to put the fluid first. If immediately after you salt it, you add the olive oil, the lemon juice, you're doing the same thing. Tavol bracha. Let's just finish salting eggs. We saw in the Gemara above that Amorim dispute whether one may salt eggs on Shabbos. They certainly agree that this is permitted according to the accepted halacha. The Shulchan Aruch rules accordingly. Aval beitzim mutar lemolchan. The Shibboleth HaLeket quotes a response of the Gaonim that prohibits salting an egg, leaving it for an extended time, and it's codified in the Shulchan Aruch. Asr noch basar mevushal or beitzim mevushalas lanicha. If you've had a cooked piece of meat or a cooked egg, and you salt it, and your intent is to set it aside and leave it for 2 weeks, that's asr. What the Achronim dispute, what does it mean leaving for an extended period? Mrabanan Hilchos Taz right that salting for a meal that will be significantly later than the upcoming meal, that's already prohibited. But according to the Eliyar Rabbah and the Gra, it's permitted. Only salting for after Shabbos is prohibited.
That's preparation. You can't do that anyway.
But it seems that the Eliyar Rabbah and the Gra are dealing with time. That they're not. It's not because I hear what you're saying. It seems like they're saying that the amount of time until after Shabbos, that's the time frame that's considered extended. The Mishnah quotes the dispute between the Mogen Avram Taz, Eliyar Rabbah, and Gra, and rules that if it is necessary to salt food to prevent it from spoiling before eating it at a subsequent meal, it's permitted. That's the Mogen Avram, the Taz, the Filu Datu Lechol Biyomo, If you're gonna salt it at lunchtime to eat it at dinner, you can't do it. Because the second suda is going to be very delayed after the first. The Rabbi says if you have an intent to leave it after Shabbos, to me it sounds like they're talking about the extended time. But if it's hot, and who also can you're concerned that the food is going to go bad if you don't salt it. You can be makel for the next suda. The Shmir Shabbos rules leniently and permits salting food that is to be consumed later in the day. Okay. And there's a nice summary on page 172 about meat, radishes, salad, eggs, and the various shitos. Very nice.
We don't use salt that way, because salt something.
To prevent, no, to prevent,
it from going
yeah.
bad.
I don't,
Not our
yeah,
thing.
it's not our thing.
Refrigerator.
159 to 173. Okay, any comments, questions?
I
Ha'ara?
even wonder if it would be the same in Eretz Yisrael as it is here, in terms of what they pickle and they don't pickle, just like we know there's some other things that there are different practices in Eretz Yisrael as here.
I'm sure.
Not on Shabbos.
Well, none of it's business in front of the shop.
Okay.
Okay.
We'll see you
Shkoyach.
next week. Shkoyach.
Have a good night, Kultiv. Thank you.
Good night.
It's good.
Good night.
Hmm.